Dragon Age Inquisition was one of those RPGs I played back when it was first released, and it never really clicked with me back then. I spent probably 5 hours at most, burnt out from the game, put it down, and never really looked back until 10 years later. Today, I'm 80 hours in, base game done, DLCs completed, and working through a second playthrough. So what made me change my mind? We'll talk about everything this game has, both the good and the bad, so you can decide for yourself whether this game is worth it today. So without further ado, this is Dragon Age Inquisition. First thing you have to know is that Inquisition is actually the third installment in BioWare's Dragon Age series, and it is both loved and hated by its fanbase. People who play the first game, Origins, generally dislike the change in tone and the simplification of the later titles, but since I've never played it, I'm gonna be judging this game purely on what it itself brings to the table. So here's the story. 10 years ago, the continent of Thedas dealt with the Fifth Blight, a cataclysmic event where dark spawns from underground invaded the surface. During the first games, this is what you were dealing with, but when your characters solve that, a new threat arises in the form of a mage rebellion and a civil war between them and the Templars. The Divine, who leads the religious order of the Chantry, had them hold peace talks in a conclave. But just when all the major players on both sides converged, a huge explosion happened which killed pretty much every important people on both sides, and a huge breach in the sky opened up which spat out demons from the world of the Fade. Your character, who will later be known as the Inquisitor, is the only survivor, and the prime suspect in the explosion that caused a giant hole in the sky. And you're also the only one with the anchor, a mark with the power to close the rifts in the breach itself. So now, like any good RPGs, the game starts off with a character creation system, and in Inquisition, you get 4 options for race. You've got your standard human, elves, dwarves, and a physically imposing horned race called the Kunari. Male and female options are available for all of them, and the creator itself is actually still pretty good even to this day. I was able to make the characters I wanted to make with a decent amount of freedom for uniqueness, but obviously since this game was released in 2014, it's not comparable to something like Dragon's Dogma 2's character creator, but it's still pretty good. You also get 2 options for voices, which I wanted to mention specifically because the voice acting is pretty good in this game.
How much is this going to cost me exactly?
And since the story is the main focus of this RPG, it's a pretty big plus. As for classes, there's 3 major ones, each with 3 specializations. In the beginning of the game, you get to choose whether you want to be a warrior who can wield either a sword and shield or a 2-handed weapon, and both of these playstyles I actually tried out in my playthrough. There's also the rogue, which can equip daggers or a bow, and then there's mage, which can only equip a staff, but they've got different options for elemental magic. Later in the game, you'll get access to specializations, but we'll get into that in a bit. For now, I just want to say that the combat in Dragon Age Inquisition is not bad, but it's not particularly good either. The term I used for my first impressions video was floaty, and I still feel the same 80 hours later. The animation looks good and it sounds good, but the enemy doesn't really react to the momentum of my swings, and the closest thing I can compare this to is MMORPG combat, which is not exactly what I want in my AAA single-player action RPG. There are some exceptions to this, like this smash skill that I like spamming for crowd control, but even then there's a slight delay to the enemy's reactions at times. In my second playthrough, I play as a mage, and since it's a ranged class, I didn't feel the floatiness quite as much, so it's not too bad for ranged classes, but even then the combat is pretty static. It's more about mastering your rotation and bringing the right skill and equipment for difficult enemies. Another interesting thing about Inquisition's combat is the tactical system, which pauses time and changes the camera's perspective to an overhead perspective. This is the more traditional RPG combat, but a lot of players generally forget it even exists. Not because it's bad, just that the action combat is a lot more efficient. This can be helpful though for tough fights, like making sure your ranged companions are actually in the back line and your tanks are keeping the danger at bay. Speaking of companions, yes, there's companions in this game. During the story, you'll do quests to unlock members of your Inquisition, and some of them can be taken with you in your adventures. They've got their own class, but you can manually level them up and thus pick their skills to suit your combat style. They've also got their own specializations, which are completely new skill trees added once unlocked. And examples of these are Iron Bull's Reaver specialization, which sacrifices health for damage, and Blackwall's Champion specialization, which turns him into an absolute tank. Of course, you can choose your specialization too and complement the characters that you like to bring with you. And these companions can also be individually controlled if you prefer their playstyles, and they can be controlled all at the same time in tactical mode. So that's combat. Now let's move on to one of the game's major features that I really enjoyed, and that is exploration. Early in the game, you'll get access to the war table, which features the maps of the nations Orlais and Ferelden. In this map, you'll see operations, which are like timed dispatch missions, but you'll also see scout missions, which cost power to unlock. Power can be acquired just by questing, but once you have enough power, you can order your troops to scout, and this will allow you to unlock a new area. These areas are really large. They're not quite open world since there's a loading screen when traveling to them, but once you're there, you're gonna feel like you're playing an open world RPG. There's a lot of things to do like quests, puzzles, and collectibles. There's also hidden areas to be unlocked, and of course, the game's lore and world building is scattered throughout the map. The most common complaint you'll hear from people is that the exploration in Inquisition is filled with bloat, time-wasting quests and mechanics that are designed to keep you playing for longer without really adding much in terms of entertainment value. Things like collecting shards and solving astrariums does reward you with some loot at the end, but it's not exactly engaging gameplay. And when there's too much of them on top of quests that are hit or miss, you'll start to see why players tend to burn out because there's just a never-ending list of not exactly entertaining things to do. That being said, some people actually enjoy this. Case in point, my girlfriend who's trying to 100% each area before moving on to the next and is having an absolute blast. Also, some of the quests are genuinely interesting, with great storytelling and mystery. Things like solving the undead problem in Crestwood, which by the end of the quest actually has a little plot twist about what happened and how those people died. Or in Empress de Leon, where you retake a fortress from a demon who tries to bargain with you. Some of these quests are really enjoyable to come across as you explore the world. And then of course, there's fetch quests, collect 10 lamb meat, and escort a cow back to the farm, which is why I said earlier that the quests in this game are hit or miss. Aside from all of that, I do like that there's a large variety between each of the explorable areas. On one hand, snow and mountains. On the other, deserts and ancient ruins and everything in between. Now let's move on to what made BioWare legendary for its time, the story. If you're not familiar with BioWare games, especially the ones from this era, they were well known for having stories that allow you to make impactful choices that affect the world. And this can be seen pretty early on in the game, where the game allows you to choose between different approaches on how to proceed with quests, which people or factions to side with, and how the Inquisition reacts to changes in the world. Or at least that's the idea behind it. Upon playing my second playthrough, I've started to notice that a lot of these decisions don't really matter, and the story will still bring you pretty much to the same place as the alternate decisions. The biggest thing is that the ending for the base game is pretty much set in stone, and the only variation you get is a variation in the epilogue based on the decisions you made along the way. There are some bright spots though, especially the romance quests, which allow you to see different sides of the characters depending on who you choose to be with, so I thought that was done decently. Now, despite all my criticisms for how the role-playing and the decision-making was handled in this game, I still enjoyed the overall story and the journey to get to the ending. It's not the most amazing story, but there were memorable moments and I really like the characters in Inquisition. They're fun to be around, they're interesting, and there's a lot of characters from previous games that do return, so that should be a treat for OG players. However, with the ending of Dragon Age Inquisition's base game comes what I would say is the strongest part of this game in the form of the DLCs, which are a must-play in my opinion, as not only do they introduce new areas, but it actually progresses the story, and the real ending can be found in the last DLC. So, there's 3 DLCs in this game: Jaws of Hakon, The Descent, and Trespassers, released in that order, and we'll be going through them pretty quickly. The first DLC, Jaws of Hakon, revolves around you trying to find out what happened to the first Inquisitor from 800 years ago. It also gives you access to a really large map called the Frostback Basin, filled with new enemies, new gear, quests, and of course a really cool storyline. The biggest highlight of this DLC for me are the boss fights. They're a decent challenge and a very welcome addition to what the base game has to offer. My most favorite DLC, however, is the second one called The Descent, which involves you and the Inquisition investigating the Deep Roads, ancient ruins underground built by the dwarves of old, and home to the Darkspawn, which was the major enemy in the earlier titles. The Descent also has the most solid story so far of any area and has remained my favorite part of the whole game. It's dark, it's gritty, and it was a really satisfying experience from start to end. The last DLC, Trespassers, is a time skip. 2 years after the events of the base game, where you will deal with the threat of the Kunaris and a mysterious agent of Fen'Harel, the elven god of rebellion. What makes this DLC really special is because this is the true ending of Dragon Age Inquisition, and the game wouldn't be complete unless you've played Trespassers. It's hard to really describe without major spoilers, but if you do decide to play this game, this is the only DLC you cannot skip. It ties up all the characters perfectly in my opinion, and also sets up the story for the 4th installment in the series, Dragon Age Dreadwolf. So is it worth it? Honestly, yeah. This is not Baldur's Gate 3 or The Witcher, but it's still a solid RPG experience. There's a lot of hiccups in that game design woven into it, but past that, the core of the game is a fun world to explore and a decent story with great, memorable characters. Subscribe if you want to see more, and also check out the Patreon where I post my video making process and updates on upcoming videos. I've started to really take this channel seriously and would love to be full-time someday, so if you enjoy what I do, please consider supporting. I'd love to do this a lot more than I do now. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.